NATO was supposed to be unbreakable, the shield of the West, the bond that held America and Europe together for 75 years. But right now, America is ripping open the alliance from the inside. 900 export permits gone overnight. $5 billion in defense trade suddenly unlocked, and in their place, a secret club, AUKUS, a defense pact so exclusive, even traditional allies are left outside the gates. Europe is furious. Washington is betting everything, and if this gamble backfires, it won't just bruise NATO, it could shatter the Western unity. It could collapse the very foundation of the West itself. For decades, NATO has been the anchor of Western defense, an alliance built on trust, shared burdens, and collective security. But as the world shifts, as China rises, as Russia threatens, as global power tilts toward the Indo-Pacific, America has quietly been building something new, something faster, something more exclusive, something called AUKUS. At first, AUKUS looked simple. Pact between the US, the UK, and Australia, unveiled in 2021. Its headline promise was nuclear-powered submarines for Canberra, a massive leap in capability, giving Australia silent hunters that could patrol deep in contested waters. But AUKUS was never just about submarines. It was about rewriting the rules of military trade and intelligence cooperation. It was about breaking through the bureaucratic walls that NATO has been trapped behind for years. Just weeks ago, Washington announced sweeping export control reforms under AUKUS. These aren't small tweaks. They remove the need for around 900 export permits a year for defense trade from Australia to the United States. They erase another 200 permits from the UK to Australia. That's billions in defense goods, estimated at over 5 billion Australian dollars annually, flowing without the traditional paperwork, without the delays, without the red tape that choke so many NATO transactions. To put that in perspective, a European defense company trying to buy advanced US technologies still faces months, sometimes years of licensing hurdles under ITAR, America's notorious international traffic in arms regulations. But under AUKUS, Australia and the UK are being fast-tracked. No waiting, no endless approvals. A privileged corridor has just been opened. And here's where the fracture begins. Because NATO allies like Germany, France, Italy, Spain, they're still on the outside, still stuck in the slow lanes of defense bureaucracy, watching as Washington hands Britain and Australia the keys to the fast lane. What does that mean? It means defense industries in Berlin and Paris, already struggling with rising costs and sluggish production, now risk being sidelined as contracts and technologies flow preferentially to AUKUS partners. It means Europe's defense autonomy, already fragile, is eroding even further, and it raises a darker question. Is NATO still the central pillar of Western defense, or has America just chosen new favorites? Let's be clear, AUKUS isn't just a trade reform. It's a strategic realignment. It locks the US, the UK, and Australia into a trilateral defense ecosystem, one designed explicitly for the Indo-Pacific. One designed to counter China's naval rise, Beijing's island fortresses, and its ambition to dominate the South China Sea. NATO, by contrast, is still structured for the Cold War, a Europe-first alliance, bogged down in debates over 2% spending targets and endless committee disputes. And so the contradictions sharpen. NATO leaders in Brussels preach unity, but Washington is building exclusivity. NATO speaks of burden sharing, but AUKUS concentrates power in 3 hands. NATO still looks to Russia, but AUKUS stares directly at China.
For Europe, the timing couldn't be worse. Russia's war in Ukraine has exposed the continent's dependency on American firepower. Germany has struggled to meet rearmament promises. France feels increasingly irrelevant. And across the continent, budgets are stretched thin by inflation, energy shocks, and political instability. NATO is fragile, yet instead of reinforcing that fragility, America appears to be investing its trust elsewhere. Take the energy front. While NATO allies in Europe scramble for US LNG, liquefied natural gas, to replace Russian pipelines, the US is simultaneously prioritizing security ties with Australia, shipping advanced tech, and easing trade flows across the Pacific. The signal is unmistakable. Washington's eyes are turning east, and Europe is left asking, where does that leave us? This isn't lost on policymakers in Brussels. The European Council has openly voiced concern that AUKUS undermines transatlantic unity. French officials, still bitter over losing a multi-billion-dollar submarine deal to AUKUS in 2021, have warned that strategic trust is eroding. Even Germany, traditionally cautious in its criticism of Washington, is beginning to worry about being sidelined in defense innovation. But America's calculus is clear. The Indo-Pacific is now the primary theater of great power competition. China, not Russia, is the pacing threat. And in that theater, Europe simply doesn't bring much to the table. Australia does. Britain, with its nuclear subs and intelligence networks, does. NATO, by comparison, looks clunky, outdated, reactive. And so the fracture deepens. As NATO debates, AUKUS executes. As NATO hesitates, AUKUS accelerates. But here's the cliffhanger. What happens when Europe realizes it's been locked out of the club? What happens when NATO's unity, already strained, breaks under the weight of exclusion? Does America end up with two alliances, one for Europe, one for Asia? And if so, can either survive intact?
This is just the opening act. Now we'll peel back the deeper layers, the global implications, the scenarios ahead, and how America's bet on AUKUS could reshape or rupture the future of Western security. The fracture isn't hypothetical anymore, it's real, it's visible, and it's deepening with every policy move out of Washington. Think about the mechanics. Under AUKUS reforms, the US, UK, and Australia can now move defense technologies, from advanced missile systems to cyber tools to nuclear propulsion tech with far fewer hurdles. That means faster delivery, faster integration, faster military readiness. Meanwhile, a NATO partner like Poland, fighting on the front lines of Russian aggression, still faces a mountain of export paperwork to acquire similar systems. That's not just inequality, that's systemic exclusion. And exclusion breeds resentment. Already, European officials are privately warning that AUKUS is a club within the club. France calls it an Anglosphere cartel. German lawmakers have questioned whether America still views Europe as its equal partner or merely as a junior ally to be managed while Washington pursues bigger prizes in Asia. The resentment is not abstract, it's political fuel waiting to ignite. Now add the numbers. The US defense trade with Australia under AUKUS reforms touches nearly $5 billion Australian dollars annually, about $3.3 billion US dollars. Combine that with Britain's integration, and you have an exclusive corridor of military commerce flowing at unprecedented speed. Europe, by contrast, remains tethered to cumbersome NATO processes, often requiring consensus among 31 members before critical moves can be made. Speed versus paralysis, foresight versus bureaucracy. It's not hard to see which model looks more appealing to Washington strategists.
But here's the paradox. By creating a faster, tighter security pact, the US risks hollowing out the very institution, NATO, that has kept the transatlantic world safe for decades. AUKUS may strengthen America's hand in Asia, but it weakens its bonds in Europe. And that raises a dangerous possibility. Two fractured halves of the West, neither fully strong enough to deter the threats they face. Let's dig into scenarios. Scenario 1. NATO adapts. Europe, stung by exclusion, finally invests in its own defense industrial base. Germany meets its rearmament pledges. France accelerates defense spending. The EU develops a parallel export system, reducing dependence on US technologies. In this version, AUKUS becomes a wake-up call, pushing Europe toward long-desired strategic autonomy. But autonomy takes decades to build, and history suggests Europe may not have the unity or urgency to deliver. Scenario 2. NATO fractures. Resentment hardens. Europe concludes America is pivoting away for good. France doubles down on its own Indo-Pacific partnerships. Germany prioritizes trade with China over defense ties with Washington. NATO drifts into dysfunction, still existing on paper, but hollow in practice. AUKUS emerges as the real engine of Western military power, while NATO becomes a fading relic. This scenario is dangerous because it gives adversaries, Russia, China, even Iran, opportunities to exploit division. Scenario 3. Dual-track alliances. America runs both, NATO in Europe, AUKUS in Asia. In theory, this covers both theaters, but in practice, it spreads US political capital thin. What happens if Russia escalates in Ukraine at the same time China blockades Taiwan? Can Washington count on fractured Europe to step up, or will America be forced to carry two alliances on its back, with fewer willing partners and more open fractures? None of these scenarios guarantee stability. All of them introduce risk. And the biggest risk of all may be perception.
Perception is power. If allies perceive NATO as second tier while AUKUS gets first-class treatment, morale cracks. If adversaries perceive NATO as divided, deterrence weakens. Vladimir Putin thrives on division. Xi Jinping thrives on exclusivity. And both are watching AUKUS with keen interest. Because every sign of Western fracture is a green light for their ambitions. Now, let's widen the lens here. Energy, economics. The stakes go beyond submarines and missiles. Europe depends on US liquefied natural gas to fill the gap left by Russia. The US has already overtaken Qatar as the largest LNG supplier to Europe, with exports surging by more than 140% since 2021. But Washington's political bandwidth is limited. If the focus shifts further east to AUKUS and the Indo-Pacific, Europe's energy security could slip from priority to afterthought. That's not just geopolitics, that's heating bills, that's blackouts, that's ordinary Europeans, and by extension, ordinary Americans, paying the cost of strategic realignment. Meanwhile, defense industries tell their own story. US companies are eyeing booming contracts with AUKUS partners. Shipyards in Australia are preparing for nuclear submarine production lines. British firms are embedded in joint cyber and AI defense projects. But in Europe, firms in Spain, Italy, and even Germany face shrinking demand, higher costs, and a creeping sense of irrelevance. What happens when industrial imbalance becomes political imbalance? When jobs shift from Hamburg to Adelaide, from Paris to Portsmouth? The fracture is no longer just military, it's economic, it's social. So, where does this leave America? On one hand, AUKUS strengthens its hand against China, no question. On the other, it risks alienating the very allies that anchor its global leadership. And here lies the ultimate contradiction. Washington is betting that a stronger Indo-Pacific presence can be built without destroying European trust. But history tells us alliances rarely survive exclusion.
Consider Suez in 1956. Britain and France acted without America, and NATO nearly split. Consider Iraq in 2003. America acted without Europe, and NATO's political core cracked for years. Now, in 2025, the fracture is forming again. Not from a war, not from an invasion, but from a policy choice. AUKUS is accelerating, and NATO is drifting. The final question is brutally simple. Can the West fight on two fronts with two fractured alliances? If NATO erodes, Russia wins. If AUKUS falters, China wins. If both stumble, America faces the nightmare of standing alone. And the gamble Washington is making today, the gamble of privileging AUKUS, may determine which future arrives. NATO was the shield of the West. AUKUS is the sword of the Indo-Pacific. But a shield without a sword is weak, and a sword without a shield is reckless. The danger now is that America, in reaching for sharper steel, may let its shield crumble. And if that happens, the fracture we're witnessing today won't just be a story of alliances, it will be a story of collapse. A collapse of unity, a collapse of deterrence, and perhaps a collapse of the West itself.